Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And let's change gears a bit on the series and talk about something a little lighter, something with a little bit more melody and upbeat charm. And frankly, this is a side of punk that you often get more on the poppy side, but I'm always a little mystified it doesn't translate to other subgenres like hardcore as often. And it's also something that I would argue can drive a lot of people away from the punk movement long term, especially the more political stuff. Yeah, punk often deals with serious issues, and the furious intensity of hardcore means that it's more naturally suited to emotions that are more negative or angry. But the truth is that a lot of that material can burn out a lot of listeners, especially when you consider the puritanical straight edge side that came out of the hardcore scene as the 1980s continued on. And yes, there is absolutely a place for that scene, and when I finally get a chance to talk about Minor Threat, we will discuss that in detail. But there's a reason why bands that at least seem like they're having a little bit more fun have a little more longevity in popular culture. Their cult following tends to stick around a little longer. And while some will definitely look down on that, unfortunately, it's hard to deny that a sense of humor and raw populism might help spread that message even further. Even the bad or misguided ideas that Dead Kennedys have had, they've stuck around thanks to Jello Biafra's delivery and wit, and you gotta respect that. So alright, let's discuss one of the more influential acts in that mold across hardcore and pop punk, who released their full-length debut album in 1982 and titled it with the expectation that their frontman Milo was going off to college, after which the band went on one of their many hiatuses. Now, they had seen some groundswell a year earlier with the Fat EP, just to give you a rough idea of the sense of humor we're dealing with, and frankly, I'm okay with that. And they'd actually been produced by Spot, the guy who worked in-house for most of SST and co-produced Black Flag's Damaged, along with a lot of others. Expect this name to come up a lot in this period, especially when it comes to the California scene. But this group was the furthest thing thematically from Black Flag, a band of hyper-caffeinated teenagers on the goofy side that in 1982, they were actively looking to buck against the serious, destructive, borderline anarcho-punk side of that scene. And in doing so, they made one of the most influential melodic hardcore records of all time and inspired countless other groups, especially the pop-punk mainstream breakthroughs in the mid to late 90s that so many of us know and love today. That's right, folks, we're talking about Milo Goes to College by the Descendents, and this is Resonators. Now, before we go any further, a few things need to be placed in context around this album, especially considering how influential that it wound up being, because it raised a loaded question that I'm surprised it took us this long to get to. How much a band should be praised or condemned for what they passed on into the genre at large? Because, let's get real, in the early days of hardcore punk, nobody could have expected records like this to go on to inspire bands that would go on to tremendous success, millions of albums sold, and then pass along their permutation of those sounds and ideas to the next generation. And that weight of legacy gets even harder to reconcile when you remember that Descendents, they made this album when they were in their early 20s, and they weren't exactly trying to convey a lot of heavier or more nuanced ideas. Yeah, Henry Rollins, he was of that age too in Black Flag, but he was also a very different character, and Black Flag was also aiming a lot higher and more serious with their content. Whereas Descendents, they were considered the lightweight, super upbeat cousin to them on the double bill. And really, that's okay. And again, with records like Milo Goes to College, it makes sense to place them in the context of their time and place. The Reagan years, they were stabilizing as the early 1980s recession eased back, and Ronald Reagan was a president from California, and the rightward culture shift was even leaking into suburbia and the baby boomers there, perhaps even more so than ever. And while the more politically minded left-wing hardcore scene was recoiling from that, the Descendents, they weren't really making that sort of content on Milo Goes to College. They were writing about girls and teen angst and being angry at their parents and other bands. And if there was political coding or subtext, it's hard to feel like that was intentional from the band. And considering this record is a blisteringly quick 22 minutes, brief nuggets of concentrated teenage emotion and angst, you can make the argument that it's not really intended to demand deeper examination into those ideas, or take a step further and say that the blunt framing of all, that's part of the point. And there's an argument there, for sure. One that I've even seen the band support. They were barely in their early 20s. The record reads like a snapshot of those teenage emotions. And one of the reasons that it's been so relatable for so long and so damn influential is that it connected with the angst on a blunt, visceral level. If it reads as immature or crass or ugly, well, that's because guys that age are kind of immature, crass, and ugly. And there's value in showcasing the purest expression of that. And I make all of those qualifying qualifying statements, because if I thought the writing had aged really awkwardly on fresh fruit for rotting vegetables, Milo Goes to College might have actually aged even worse. I've seen critics make a comparison of this record to the movie Revenge of the Nerds, and yeah, they're not wrong, because for as much as it might serve as a shot of catharsis for the awkward, angry, but overall nice nerdy guys of that era, or hell of any era, it also contains a lot of the same ugly subtext that has made that movie a lot harder to watch over 30 years later. And it's where it gets the broader influence question gets a lot more troubling, because you can definitely see a lot of the same creative DNA passed down to countless bands in melodic hardcore and especially pop punk, even down to some of the less comfortable details. And for example, it's hard not to hear a song like Kabuki Girl on Milo Goes to College and then see the Asian fetish across the writing of Rivers Cuomo, and you can't deny there could be a connection there. And it's not even getting to the songs written about women, and again, it's hard for me to directly blame Descendents for the brand of nice guy projection that definitely kind of sours and can turn mean-spirited. It can land as uncomfortable in the writing because it rings as coming from a real, dangerously relatable place for any nerdy nice guy, and I speak from experience there. But at the same time, Descendents weren't exactly questioning it, or framing the larger scene with a level of self-awareness to question how clingy and creepy and genuinely uncomfortable this could have read to those girls years later. And then you have to wonder how much pop punk could have changed for the better if they had asked those questions or had been confronted on this issue sooner. And what gets kind of awkward is that Descendents actually did get called out for one song on Milo Goes to College, specifically I'm Not a Loser, where in a fit of fury against some privileged, pompous ass, they scream a bunch of insults, they claim they are not a loser, he's the real bad guy, and then out comes the gay slurs. And again, I understand why this might have happened in the time. They're white suburban guys breaking in 1982, calling somebody gay as an insult is an easy way to prop up insecure teenage masculinity, especially when they can feed into the extended 70s backlash. And hey, it could be somewhat self-aware and highlighting how much of a loser they might be. And it wasn't until years later when the rock critical establishment even bothered to call them out on it. But even the band has realized it wasn't really okay the way they did it on that song. But even nowadays, it's hard to go back to songs like My Age and Marriage and Hope and read them as the sort of friend zone anthems that might reflect an emotional honesty, but also reflect an ugliness that mostly went ignored at the time and in some critical re-examinations, especially when it's paired with songs like the slut-shaming of Bike Age or Gene is Dead, a song that not only shows a thin example of how they think they could have fixed the depression to prevent the suicide of Gene in the song, but then all place it in the angst of their loneliness. And again, when you frame it against such generally upbeat melodies, it's hard not to get the impression that Descendents aren't exactly being super self-aware here, except when you get songs like Tony Age or I'm Not a Punk or Catalina or even Suburban Home, songs that drip with sarcasm but also do a decent job highlighting their own insecurities and wants, especially when hardcore punk was demanding its own weird form of conformity. It's one reason why Catalina is a great damn song, probably my favorite here. It's got a punk narrator blasting women and calling them whores as he just wants to go out in his boat off the shore, and then his boat breaks down. And even as he tries to pull up his Beatles and Doors tapes, it's not gonna be enough to really get that girl out of his head as much as he tries. And some of the writing does come from that place of teenage confusion. M16 and Statue of Liberty show the mess of contradictions surrounding blind patriotism in the face of Ronald Reagan's America doing some really bad things of times of war in the 1980s. And the fact that we don't really get clean answers to those questions, that helps the adolescent framing of this record. I see that argument. And here's the other really frustrating thing. Outside of my problems with the songwriting, I generally really like the sound of this album, especially on the musical level. Milo Aukerman can really sell that unsteady balance between raw intensity and nerdy teenage awkwardness, Spot's production drawing emphasis to the bass melodies that really have solid interplay with the guitar work, and the Descendents, even today, but even going back to that album, they are a maddeningly catchy group. And even if I have issues with the writing, the songs they blaze by at such a fast clip that you barely have time to sink into the details, which is probably one of the big reasons they got away with as much as they did, even to this day. The phenomenal bass riffs and the insane drum work on My Age, and the irrepressibly goofy I Wanna Be a Bear, the bass spiking into the guitar lead on M16, the melodic complexity behind the lead guitar on Catalina, and even despite my lyrical issues with songs like Hope and Gene is Dead, they are still catchy as hell in that melody line. And when you get songs that get a little slower and showcase more development, like the lead in for Bike Age or the bass interplay on Suburban Home, you see so much of the instrumental chops chops that would lead to that more developed punk sound they would push on later records. Maybe slow down a little bit more, but the melodic strengths were still there. Now, granted, how short many of these songs are, you have to find yourself wishing for a little more meat on the bones, but hey, that's hardcore. And while Descendents didn't stick long in the subgenre, you can't really doubt the talent that was displayed across the board, especially in drummer Bill Stevenson and bassist Tony Lombardo. If you just consider the sound of this album, you probably have no problem with them being as influential as they are, and you can hear their DNA in so many groups, especially in the mid to late 90s. As I said again, the problem here is that it wasn't just their sound that became influential, but so much of their framing, so much of their content. And considering similar issues, they haven't really gone away throughout pop punk and hardcore punk over the course of decades now. That's a little harder for me just to ignore from the sidelines. And that can't help but somewhat color my view of Milo Goes to College. A damn good album, but one that kind of cooled on me the more I dug into the lyrics beyond just the ones the band regrets today. It's a product of its time, sure, but it's also very telling for as progressive as punk and music critics covering it have claimed to be, the critical reputation of Milo Goes to College is mostly unscathed. Still, I understand its appeal. I certainly get why it's as influential as it is, but for me personally, it's a 7 out of 10, and it's recommended, but mostly enjoyed if you ignore the lyrics and you understand what it was for its time. And hey, the Descendents, they're still active today. They make some great music. They've recanted the stuff, a lot of the issues I have with this album, they walked away from, and they're definitely a lot wiser for that. So, hey, I can respect them at least, so yeah, it's worth it for punk history. Check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know this was a tricky episode of Resonators, and I can imagine, like, a lot of people have gone in on Dead Kennedys for some of the political issues, but I can imagine this record hasn't quite gotten this level of critical re-examination in some time. At least from my research, I couldn't find it. But hey, I gotta be honest here, this record just didn't age quite as well as you might have thought, especially in some of the writing. But hey, if you want to actually buy the record, links in the description below, and I got the poll up there for all you guys to tell me how wrong I am, and I know there will be a lot of you. Beyond that, if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule, so there you got your option there. And if you want to see my schedule, it's on my Instagram, link below. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.